What if the most dangerous weapon America sent to one of the world's most explosive flashpoints wasn't a stealth bomber, wasn't a cutting-edge missile system, and wasn't even built in this century? What if it was a slow, ugly, loud aircraft that Pentagon officials had been trying to scrap for over a decade? And what if that decision ended up changing the entire course of a war? Here is where the story actually begins. Not with the jet, not even with the war. It begins with a stretch of water so strategically important that threatening it even slightly sends shockwaves across every grocery store, every gas station, and every economy on the planet. The Strait of Hormuz is barely 20 miles wide at its narrowest point. The actual shipping lanes inside it are even tighter. And through that tiny corridor moves roughly 1/5 of all the world consumes every single year. 1/5. Think about that for a second. If you put a handful of small boats in the right places and made enough people afraid, you wouldn't need to fire a single missile at a superpower to hurt it. You just have to make everyone too scared to move their tankers through. That is exactly what Iran did. And for a while, it was working. When the United States and Israel launched a joint military operation against Iran in late February of this year, a campaign the Pentagon named Operation Epic Fury, the opening strikes accomplished something almost no one genuinely believed was possible. Iran's supreme leader, the man who had held near-minus total control over the country for nearly 4 decades, was killed in the first wave. For any government, losing its top leader in the opening hours of a conflict is catastrophic. But for a political system built entirely around the absolute authority of one individual, it wasn't just a military blow. It was closer to a collapse of the entire foundation the regime was standing on. Within roughly a week, Iran's ruling council, under heavy pressure from the Revolutionary Guard, appointed the deceased leader's own son as the new supreme leader. His name was Murtaba, and he was known as a significantly more hardline figure than his father. He had deep ties to the Revolutionary Guard, the same ideological military force that essentially functions as the regime's most loyal enforcer. His appointment wasn't a sign of panic. It was a deliberate signal to the world. The message was, we are not backing down. If anything, we're going harder. And Iran did go harder, just not in the way most people expected. Iran did not try to match the United States in a conventional naval fight. They never had any real chance of winning that kind of battle. The U.S. Navy has aircraft carriers, guided missile destroyers, and an air superiority that Iran simply cannot compete with ship for ship or jet for jet. Iran's leadership understood this decades ago, so instead of trying to win a fight it couldn't win, Iran chose to make the entire region too dangerous, too unpredictable, and too expensive for the global economy to ignore. They reached for the one tool they had spent 40 years building and refining: fast attack boats, sea mines, swarming tactics, harassment runs against merchant vessels. Not glamorous, not cinematic, but brutally effective at doing one thing: making the Strait of Hormuz feel like a war zone that no tanker captain or insurance company wanted anything to do with. Within days of the operation beginning, Iran had effectively weaponized the strait. Small, fast Revolutionary Guard boats were swarming commercial ships. Mines were being laid. Tanker captains were refusing to enter the waters. Insurance companies either stopped covering Gulf transits altogether or started charging premiums so high that some voyages simply made no financial sense to attempt. Oil prices climbed toward $120 per barrel in the first weeks. Some Gulf officials were warning of $180 if the situation dragged into late spring. More than 20. So merchant sailors from dozens of countries, most of whom had nothing to do with the conflict, found themselves stranded aboard anchored ships, waiting for a war they never asked to be part of to decide whether it was safe to move. The economic pain was spreading fast. And this is the thing that matters most about Iran's strategy: it didn't need to sink an American warship to cause damage. It just needed to make the strait unusable. Every day the ships couldn't move was another day oil markets panicked. Fuel prices climbed, and ordinary people in countries thousands of miles from the Gulf felt the consequences without even understanding why. This is called asymmetric warfare. The logic behind it is almost elegant in how ruthless it is. If you can't dominate a battlefield outright, you make that battlefield so painful and so unpredictable that your stronger opponent starts wondering if the cost is worth it. Iran had been rehearsing this exact strategy for decades. Tanker seizures, limpet mine attacks on ships in the Gulf of Oman, gunboats swarming commercial vessels in international waters. Each individual incident looked like an isolated provocation. Together, they were a regime running drills for the full version of what it was now doing in plain sight. So what did the United States do? It sent the Warthog. In mid-March, General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stood at a Pentagon podium and confirmed something that on the surface almost sounded like a joke. A-10 Thunderbolt jets aircraft that had first flown in the 1970s. Aircraft that multiple rounds of Pentagon budget planners had tried to retire. Aircraft that most of Congress had assumed were basically museum pieces waiting for a decommissioning ceremony were now flying active combat missions over the Strait of Hormuz. They were hunting and destroying Iran-fast attack boats. One by one, hour by hour. The images that came out shortly afterward told their own story. Warthogs connected to aerial refueling tankers, taking on fuel mid-flight to extend their time in the air. Not a quick strike into return to base, these jets were staying up for hours at a time, circling the same patch of water. Watching, waiting. That single detail, the mid-air refueling, told every military analyst watching exactly what was happening. This wasn't a symbolic show of force. This was a patient, sustained, methodical campaign, and it raises an obvious question with all of the sophisticated, expensive, technologically advanced aircraft the United States has. Why would any commander reach for a jet that predates personal computers? The answer has nothing to do with nostalgia. It has everything to do with what the mission actually demanded. Iranian-fast attack boats are small. They're fast. They're cheap. They're specifically designed to blend into the chaos of one of the world's busiest waterways, the Strait, the fishing traffic, the merchant vessels, the general noise of a place where thousands of ships pass every year. A supersonic stealth fighter screaming through its speed gets one look at the water below it, one very fast, very brief look. It needs to already know exactly where the target is before it even begins its attack run, or it goes home having accomplished nothing. The A-10 doesn't have that problem. Its entire design philosophy is patience. It can fly low and slow for hours. It can circle. It can study. It can wait for a boat to move in a way that doesn't match the pattern of honest fishing traffic, slightly to fast, slightly to deliberate, keeling away at the wrong moment in the wrong direction. And then, once that moment comes, it doesn't hesitate. At the center of the Warthog's identity is a weapon called the GA-U-8 Avenger, a rotary cannon firing 30-mm rounds originally designed to punch through the armor of Soviet tanks during a Cold War that never became a hot one. Against a lightly built fiberglass speedboat, that level of firepower isn't surgical. It's total. But the cannon isn't the only tool the A-10 carries. It also carries guided missiles, laser-guided rockets, and short-range air-to-air missiles for defense against drones. In practice, the choice of weapon on any given mission comes down to distance and risk. A target farther out might be better handled by a guided missile. A target close in? Once the pilot has studied it long enough to be certain, why turn the cannon? The jet carries options. What makes it effective is the time it takes to understand the situation before using any of them. This is the difference between a sprinter and a hunter. A sprinter is more impressive on paper, faster, more agile, able to cover ground quickly. But a hunter who will sit motionless and patient for 6 hours, watching and waiting, is the one who actually gets the job done. When the target is small, unpredictable, and designed to hide, the Warthog is built to be the hunter. Every other high-end aircraft in the American inventory was built to be the sprinter. And sprinters are the wrong tool when the enemy is hiding in plain sight among fishing boats. The airframe itself reflects decades of hard lessons about what keeps a pilot alive in exactly this kind of low-altitude, high-risk environment. The cockpit is encased in a titanium structure thick enough to protect against serious hits from below and the sides. Crews call it the bathtub. The flight control systems are deliberately redundant, built so the aircraft can continue flying even after absorbing damage that would send a more modern jet spiraling to the ground. The A-10 is not fast. It is not stealthy. What it is stubborn, and a mission profile that requires flying low over hostile water for hours at a stretch. Stubbornness is worth more than speed. The risk was real. Though, the Strait of Hormuz during this conflict was not empty. Undefended airspace. Iran had layered coastal air defense systems along its side of the water, older platforms acquired from foreign suppliers before sanctions made that difficult, and newer domestically produced systems built specifically to fill the gaps. None of it was state-of-the-art, but stacked together along a coastline that close to where the A-10 were operating. It was more than enough to make low-altitude missions genuinely dangerous. The threat wasn't theoretical. During one connected mission in the same broader campaign, an A-10 went down while supporting a search and rescue operation to recover the downed F-15E crew members in a separate part of the fight. The pilot survived and was recovered. The aircraft did not. That loss is important to acknowledge clearly. This was not a risk-free operation dressed up in easy heroism. Commanders made a calculated judgment that the mission fit the platform, that the threat the A-10 seconds were addressing was significant enough to accept the danger, and that the jet's specific capabilities in this environment outweighed the vulnerabilities it carried into that airspace. The decision to double down only reinforced that judgment. Weeks after the initial missions were confirmed, reports emerged that an additional 18 A-10 seconds were being sent to the region, joining the roughly dozen already flying missions around the Gulf, nearly tripling the Warthog presence in a matter of weeks. Militaries don't do that with aircraft they consider obsolete relics. They do it with tools that are measurably working. And while the Warthogs were working the surface threat, the wider campaign around them was hitting harder targets, fortified infrastructure, reinforced positions along the coast, targets that required precision weapons far heavier than anything the A-10 carries. Official statements never fully detailed every element of that wider effort. But the visible pattern was clear enough on its own: different tools for different problems. Slow aircraft and cannon fire for the boats on the water. Heavier, precisely guided munitions for everything buried or hardened enough to need something bigger to crack. A-tiered approach matched precisely to the nature of each target, rather than one blunt instrument applied to everything. The numbers that eventually came out publicly were significant. American commanders said forces had destroyed more than 100 Iranian naval vessels, including dozens of boats specifically used for mine-laying. Those figures came from the Pentagon, and wartime numbers always deserve a degree of healthy skepticism. But even accounting for that caution, the trend was undeniable. The strategy that had shut down 1/5 of the world's oil supply was being dismantled piece by piece. The boats that had made merchant captains too afraid to move were being removed from the water. The tool Iran had spent for decades building and trusting was being systematically ground down. It is worth sitting with what that actually meant beyond the military scorecard. Every fast attack boat destroyed wasn't just a tactical win or regional conflict. Each one was a direct hit on Iran's ability to hold the global economy hostage through fear. Iran's entire choke-point strategy depends on uncertainty. It depends on merchant crews being afraid. It depends on insurance underwriters refusing to cover the route. It depends on oil markets panicking. The moment those boats started disappearing faster than they could threaten, the fear equation started shifting. And without the fear, the strategy collapses. That story only works if the toughness looks real. Every boat destroyed by a 46-year old American aircraft chipped away at that image in a way that was visible to the entire world. It is difficult to sell the narrative of a defiant regime holding a superpower at bay when the weapon you are relying on is being dismantled by something most people assumed was already in a museum. The human cost underneath all of this deserves more attention than it typically gets in coverage focused on strategy and hardware. The sailors stranded on anchored ships near the Strait were not naval officers who signed up for combat risk. They were civilian crew members from dozens of different countries, most with no stake in the conflict at all, doing a job that normally involves nothing more hazardous than bad weather and exhausting schedules. At the height of the crisis, more than 20. 0 of them were waiting aboard more than 3. 0 vessels for a geopolitical dispute they had nothing to do with to resolve itself enough to let them move. Port workers in Gulf countries lost shifts. Local economies that depended on that traffic absorbed hits that no political speech was going to acknowledge or compensate. And in households thousands of miles away, people who couldn't have placed the Strait of Hormuz on a map under any circumstances started feeling the effects at gas stations and grocery stores without understanding why prices were climbing. That is the real violence of choke-point warfare. It doesn't stay contained to the combatants. It bleeds outward through supply chains, energy markets, and shipping routes until it reaches ordinary people who never had any say in the decisions that started the conflict. Iran's state messaging tried to frame this as resistance. It was leverage economic pressure applied through civilian vulnerability, dressed in the language of defiance to make it sound principled. None of this story ended cleanly. There is a much larger argument humming underneath all of this, one that goes well beyond Iran and well beyond one stretch of contested water. Modern militaries have spent the last several decades and staggering amounts of money building the most sophisticated weapons ever: stealth aircraft, satellite-guided munitions, sensor systems that can theoretically detect threats from hundreds of miles away. And in this conflict, as in others running parallel to it around the world, the threats doing the most damage have consistently been the cheap ones. Small boats, drones costing a fraction of the missiles fired to destroy them, sea mines barely changed in basic design for a century. Shipping lanes elsewhere in the world have already been living through their own versions of this same problem, disrupted by groups with no real military power, using improvised weapons and minimal costs to make heavily armed opponents spend fortunes responding. And between those two moments sat weeks of a slow, grinding, largely invisible fight over a narrow stretch of water where an aircraft most people had already written off turned out to be exactly the right tool for a problem that nothing newer, faster, or more expensive was built to solve. That matters not because it makes a good military story, though it does. It matters because it tells you something true about how the world actually works beneath the surface of the headlines. The most expensive answer isn't always the right one. The newest technology doesn't automatically win. And sometimes not always. But sometimes the machine everyone gave up on is the one still in the air when the smoke clears and the fighting finally stops. The A-10th Thunderbolt was never supposed to still be flying combat missions in 2026. It was supposed to be retired, replaced by sleeker, faster, more expensive platforms that look better on paper and fit more neatly into the technological trajectory the Pentagon had been projecting for decades. But wars do not fight themselves according to PowerPoint presentations. They are fought in the messy, unpredictable places where strategies fail and the obvious answers turn out to be wrong. And in that messy reality, the ugly old jet that refused to die proved something that no amount of advanced technology alone could replicate. Patience cannot be downloaded. It cannot be coded into an algorithm. It cannot be purchased at any price. And in the end, that patience was worth more than the entire arsenal of newer, faster, more expensive machines that had been designed to replace it. The question this leaves us with, the one that extends far beyond the Strait of Hormuz, is not whether the newest technology wins. It is whether the institutions that build our weapons and plan our wars have started to confuse what looks impressive with what actually works. And whether, in the next conflict in some other narrow waterway, some other contested space, we will have already scrapped the one tool we will turn out to need most.